Mm-hmm. Well, hello everybody and welcome to DataArt IT Talk. Today we will talk about Future of JavaScript and TC39 with our special guest and expert Ujjwal Sharma. If you will have any questions you would like to ask, just please type the comments below and I will read it for you. Well, Ujjwal, welcome.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to this presentation. We're hoping this time for less of a presentation and more of a discussion, so please feel free to talk. Welcome from the beautiful city of St. Petersburg. It's freezing outside, but we're here. And I want to talk to you about JavaScript and about TC39. There's this committee called TC39, which is responsible for the programming language that you all love or probably hate. But how does it work, and how can you get involved, and what does it do even? So first of all, a lot of people are confused about the name. Why is it TC39? The name doesn't explain anything, really. It sounds so weird and arbitrary. So TC39 is the 39th technical committee in ECMA International. ECMA International is the organization. It's a Swiss standards organization for European computer manufacturers. Doesn't make any sense anymore because they're not doing any computer manufacturing. But it was started like that by IBM and Hitachi and all these companies coming together, and now they do JavaScript. So they create this language, this specification called ECMAScript, which is implemented in browsers, and you all may write this language. But how do developers get involved in this process, and how can you give your feedback when you're working with these things? So for example, we have this website, which is the main TC39 website, so to say. It's their landing page, tc39.es, and it tries to explain some of the things about what we do and how we work and so on. So there's a bunch of descriptions, how you can contribute. So you can see the contributor guide, which is specifically for individuals. So you can visit and you can find out how to get involved as just a programmer, as an engineer, give your feedback, get involved in some of the proposals. Or your company can join, DataArt probably, can join TC39 meetings as an ECMA member. So more on that later. But how does it all happen? So we can check out the how we work. The second tab would be, yeah, and it's my comment at the top. But how we work is a repository that we have that documents how we operate and how to participate in this. It has a lot of stuff about everything, really. How to champion a proposal, how to write a good explainer, and you can follow all of these. And how it actually happens is that anybody can make a proposal to JavaScript. Any change in or addition to the language is done using a proposal. So you can make a proposal and present it to the committee, and then it can go through all the different stages and then be added to the language. The language itself, if we go to the first slide, the first tab, it says here, we develop JavaScript, formerly ECMAScript, as a specification. So it's actually, the entire programming language is just a bunch of text files. It's a bunch of text files that describe how the language should work, and then different people, like the Chrome team or the Firefox team, just implement that and write it down in code the way they like. If you see the second last tab, there would be the actual spec. This is the spec. It was published not so long ago, and this document has everything. It literally defines the entire JavaScript language. So you can see, you can read this, and you can see stuff like, hey, how do these statements work? And what are numbers, for example, in JavaScript? So there's all these things, but The fun part, the interesting part is not maybe the main language itself, but the proposals. That's what we're here to talk about, the future, and what different things people are working on, and how you get involved. So we have a few people here. Do any of you have any favorite proposals? Any proposals that you know about? Would you like to talk about it?
Can you say something about pattern matching?
Pattern matching. Okay. So pattern matching is, for those of you who don't know, pattern matching is a way in many programming languages like Rust or many functional programming languages to match a specific value against many patterns. And it's not there in JavaScript yet. And we're working on a proposal that is a very ambitious pattern matching proposal. It builds on top of the very quite little ambitious switch statement that we have in JavaScript. Switch right now is just a bunch of if-else statements clopped together. And now they're building it using pattern matching. So it's going to be much better, much more efficient, and much more versatile at what you can look for. For example, you work with so many prototypes at DataArt, and that's something that you could work with in pattern matching. So that's a fun one. Thank you. Actually, if you go to the third tab, this is the TC39 proposals GitHub repository. So you can see TC39/proposals, and it has all the proposals, and it has all the information. So who is the author of this proposal, right? As I was saying, you can make your own proposals, and then you'll be the author of that proposal. And then it also talks about who's the champion of this proposal. So if the author is not in the committee, they can ask somebody who's on the committee, a member, a delegate, a invited expert, to actually be their champion. So to explain a little bit, what are champions? There was this system in the Middle Ages where when two parties couldn't settle a dispute, they would assign somebody to fight for them. And that's quite literally how champions work. We do a lot of fighting in committee, unfortunately. And this champion is the person who's willing to fight for you and for your proposal. So as you can see, there's many champions. Sometimes the authors are the champions. Sometimes there's champions who are not the authors, and so on. And literally every proposal is right here. So I just mentioned members and delegates. What are these, right? As I was saying, you can obviously join. In order to attend a meeting and get it involved, you can, of course, ask your employer to join and become a member. And then each member can have delegates. So these delegates are people who represent their company or their employer when they are there. For example, I am a delegate for my employer, Igalia. And there's delegates from Google, from Microsoft, from PayPal, and so on. Invited experts are people who are not delegates, but who are experts in some area or in JavaScript in general, who are community representatives maybe, and they're invited by the committee to come help them. So for example, if it's interesting that the second biggest contributor on this proposals repository is Sergey, who is the only Russian person, by the way, great guy, on TC39. And he is an invited expert, and he does all of this crazy amount of work in his free time. So that's something that you can do if you have lots of free time or you're very committed to JavaScript, or you could just contribute. You don't have to be so deeply involved in the whole committee. You can just pick your favorite proposal and start working on it in your own leisure. So as you can see, the ECMA 262 repository, that is just the spec, but the source code. So the spec is literally just an HTML file, and we edit it and add more things to it and add proposals. So there's many proposals that we can talk about, but let's talk to you all. Which proposals do you think about? So do you have
No questions?
any Takers? Okay.
It's actually hard.
You think
yeah,
about
but
too many proposals at the same
yes,
time.
but maybe you can tell something again about decorators. That's hard question. Yeah. That's
Why
one
did
of
you
the
have
most
to mention
understanding.
decorators? Now my entire day is ruined. No, decorators are great, and people love decorators. People, let me fix that. People love decorators way too much. So much that they have been working on this proposal for, I think, over 10 years now, and it still hasn't happened because everybody has very strong opinions and they're willing to fight for it. And so that's what I think decorators needs. Decorators would need somebody like you, somebody with a fresh perspective and somebody with a lot of energy to actually come ahead and fix some of the issues, talk to all the different stakeholders and iron out the details. So, well, decorators, if you love them, you can help make them happen. And a great example for this for me is the realms proposal, right? Realms or zones, all these sort of discussions have been happening in the TC39, in Node, in all these spaces for over 15 years, and they never happened because people cannot agree about how to make them work. And then one day, somebody from Salesforce comes along and says, okay, I have an idea and I can make this work. And then we came up with a design that is now at stage 3. So it's now being implemented in browsers, and that's the realm with a callable boundary. So it's a realm, and they're completely isolated, so you cannot share objects between them, but you can share references to functions, and then you can call these functions in another realm. So there is a callable boundary. You can call stuff from inside and outside. So there's message passing, right? There's remote procedure calls, but you cannot share data. You can only share function calls. So that's how realms worked after 15 arduous years of just fighting. And maybe decorators can be like that. Maybe decorators will happen, and it will happen in a way that makes us think that it was good for them to not happen for such a long time, because we struggled and came up with a beautiful design that is just much more helpful to everyone. So that's that about decorators. We have nicer proposals.
Thank you. What do you prefer?
You know what I prefer. I prefer temporal. Temporal is great. Everybody loves it. So the story about temporal, do any of you know about temporal? Except for Victor. Let me tell you about temporal. It's like, you know, those people, let's talk about the environment. It's like, no. So I am the poster child of temporal. It is a proposal that I worked on, and I love it so much. The thing about temporal is that there is a date object in JavaScript, right? Date object was added in 1995. It was before I was even born. And it sucks, for the lack of a better word. It sucked when it was added, and it sucks even worse today. So it is horrible to the extent that it's nearly impossible to write code with this object. Anybody who does anything with dates and times in JavaScript is either using Moment or Luxon or some other library that can help them write sane code. And that's the beauty of temporal, is that it fixes these problems and allows you to write good code.
Ujjwal, thank you. We have a question. So what is the future of JavaScript?
What is the future of JavaScript? That's interesting. Well, all of these things, really. We have all these different proposals that are cooking up, and hopefully with things like pattern matching, we might come to a point where people write the language in a much different way than they do right now. For me, the future of JavaScript, it's a little thing that I have been thinking about and have been planning to work on, is multi-core JavaScript. So JavaScript was designed in a very different world, right? JavaScript was designed in the 1990s when CPUs would scale using frequency, and CPUs would get faster and faster. And that's just not how computers work anymore. Computers have shifted towards scaling using cores. So now computers come with a lot of cores, like, you know, any new mobile processor or any like the Apple M1 Mac. They have lots of cores, and then they can shut down cores if you need to save battery and so on. And so the tiniest computers available today have at least 4 or even 8 cores. And this is interesting because JavaScript doesn't tap into that. JavaScript is a single core, single thread language, and we added threading using workers and worker threads and so on, but it's still stuck there. And for me, what I'd like to see and what I'd like to work on is a multi-core JavaScript, a JavaScript where you can write code that can run efficiently on any device, and that would just be so amazing. You can run, let's say, 8 times faster on a phone, and I think that would make JavaScript quite more interesting.
Well, cool, thank you. I have another question for you. And what is your nightmare as a JavaScript developer? Brain-computer interface without JS, or simply the fast rise of WebAssembly?
Well, thank you. I don't know why people think about this, about WebAssembly. I think WebAssembly is amazing. I mean, my team works on it as well. But I think WebAssembly is not a competition for JavaScript. As somebody who has invested almost my entire life on JavaScript, I've working on Node and TC39 and everything. I think that a lot of people hate JavaScript because they do not realize that it's a tool, and it's a tool for doing specific things, and you can use a tool to do the wrong thing and then be frustrated by it, but it's not an issue with the tool, it's an issue with how you're trying to solve this problem. So WebAssembly, I think, is a way for a lot of really smart developers saying, okay, there's things that we need to do on the browser that require heavy computation, that require a lot of low-level computing, that shouldn't be done in JavaScript. And so WebAssembly is there for that. If you're building games that run on a browser, if you're building complicated applications, putting filters on a photo, well, use WebAssembly. But WebAssembly is not JavaScript. It's not for rendering. It's not for putting your name on a website. And so JavaScript and WebAssembly, I believe, can not only coexist, but they can actually complement each other. You can use the right tool for the right job.
Great, thank you. Another question. Will we ever see times when we have to break backward compatibility?
I hope not. I hope not. Some people talk about this, but this, for me, is the beauty of the web, and it's one of the most special things that we work with a constraint that is bigger than anybody else does, because they have to just design a language. TypeScript people have to just design a language. Python people just design a language. But for JavaScript, we can never break with the past. So all of our past mistakes, we need to carry forward. And so it's like that poem where the guy shoots an albatross and it's hanging around his neck, right? So we walk around with this albatross around our neck, like date, like all these things that we added in the past. But I think that's beautiful. It's beautiful that you could write a website in 1998 and it would still work on any modern browser. And I think that's the promise of the web, that I can write something today that would just live on forever.
Thank you so much. Another question. When we will have another framework that we will all have to learn?
A new framework?
Yeah.
Oh, just a second. Think in the next 10 minutes or so. But yeah, on a more serious note, I think personally, and it's a very personal opinion, but I think the sort of tumultuous framework times have kind of ended. I think people and just the industry in general had this phase where things were popping up and everything was moving fast. But I think for the front-end world, for front-end frameworks, I think the market or the community, you could say, has consolidated. People have been divided into clear camps. So, React reigns supreme. Everybody writes React. And there's people who do specific things. They want Svelte. There's people who do specific things that use Vue. And there's people who work at huge companies who write Angular. But that's mostly it. And I think these frameworks are evolving within themselves. They have found a small market or a big market in case of React for themselves, and they're just evolving. So I don't think there can be something that maybe there can be something that will come out, but I think these frameworks have consolidated the existing community very well, and they're looking after their own sort of groups of people.
Cool, thank you. And another question then. So even if the year 2100 type of null will be object?
Type of null, maybe Victor can answer that. But no, a type of null is object because null is an object. It's just, it's a very complicated thing, and it sort of brings me back to what we discussed, which is that unfortunately or fortunately, we cannot break the web. So anything, you might consider this a mistake, or you might consider this a good thing, but either way, we have to live with this. So there's so much code that relies on this, and because of this, we can never change it. So it will always be object.
Okay, thank you so much. And why so many people like to tell how much they hate JavaScript? Oosh.
That's a very, very interesting question. It's something that brings me back to my passions. I hope I can answer this freely. I think for developers, we have a very strong feeling that we're great and we're awesome and we're very smart people, and that we need to be this way. And because of this, there is a lot of elitism and so on in the developer community sometimes. For a long, long time, in order to just write a simple application, in order to build something as simple as a web page, you would need to learn something that would require years of training, years of work, and so on. I think, and I love this about JavaScript, is that JavaScript aims to change that. I think JavaScript is a language that can be learned by something quite easily. It makes programming quite approachable for everyone, right? Your grandma could be learning JavaScript. But at the same time, it can make you do powerful things. You can build really anything these days with JavaScript. And I think some people dislike that. Some people dislike that there is something that is seemingly a toy language that you can learn over 2 weekends or so, and then you can just do whatever.
Cool. And what about Next.js?
Next.js. Next.js is very interesting for me. The beauty that we are going back to server-side rendering is still great. I think Next.js is special because of the whole isomorphic concept, right? The fact that you're running JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the back end, and we were for a long time, but then they were not working with quite each other. And so this is why I love the isomorphic web, because the line between the front end and the back end gets closer, and there's you're putting it together. So you're writing React code, but some of it's rendering on the client, some of it's rendering on the server. And I think that's quite an interesting balance to make. And I think it's quite amazing how people can write their websites using this and sort of tweak where they want to make that boundary.
Thank you. And does TC39 have plans to get rid of project builders like Webpack or Rollup?
Yes, thank you. Okay, yes. Also no, for the short answer, but thank you for asking me about that. So one of the proposals that me and my team are working on is native bundling in JavaScript. We feel that we had a promise, and then that we were betrayed. We were betrayed by HTTP2. When HTTP2 came along, we thought that we would not need bundles, that every file could just be transported throughout the internet easily. That didn't happen. People still used bundlers. Then we got ES modules. And then we thought, okay, this would maybe work out. But then it kind of doesn't still. Almost everybody who's writing ES modules on the front end right now is still bundling that. And it's still passing around on the internet actually at the end using normal JavaScript. So we think that in order for ESM to actually exist, like it already exists, but not just as a format that you write code with, as a format that you can ship code with, we need native bundling in JavaScript. So we are working with the WPAC group in IETF for creating native resource bundles for the web in general. And we're working in JavaScript for things like module blocks so that you can do native bundling in JavaScript. And I think that will be something that should happen really soon.
Thank you. And how does TypeScript affect the JavaScript future, or does it have no effect at all?
Sorry, step?
How does TypeScript affect the JavaScript future, or maybe it's not?
Well, TypeScript affects JavaScript's future because okay, I keep talking about this only proposals that I work on. So I'm so sorry, I'm biased. But TypeScript affects JavaScript's future in a positive way, I think, because it allows us to pick up techniques that we think are useful. So for example, one of the proposals that are just going through TC39 right now is fixed shape objects. So you can create objects with a fixed shape and you can pass them around. And it's actually super useful, we realize, for WebAssembly, where you do have everything fixed shape. And so for me, this is the main utility and the main beauty of TypeScript for JavaScript, is that we can look at TypeScript and all the things that they do and sort of pick up some of their techniques. For example, one of the proposals that we're working on is types as comments. So it is like TypeScript, but you can specify your types in your code as comments. And I think it would be even more useful than TypeScript because it can be used sort of interoperably between different tools. And I think that would be great.
Thank you. And could you tell about static typing? Are there proposals? Does TypeScript affect current JS length development? And TC39 avoids to add new syntax to JS that can ruin TypeScript. Is that the problem?
Oh, so for the first part, static typing is something that people discuss sometimes, but the problem with static typing is that it's so against the existing nature of JavaScript that it would completely change the way we write and think about JavaScript. And I think that's not so good. So I think JavaScript is designed from the first day to be a dynamically typed language. There's some beauty to that, and we should maintain it. About the proposal, it was, I believe, the same proposal that I was talking about, types as comments. And I don't think it will ruin JavaScript. If anything, it would make it better. People ask me what I think about TypeScript all the time, and we joke about how I hate TypeScript. I don't hate TypeScript, but I do feel that TypeScript loses a lot of potential, right? As somebody who used to work on the optimizing compiler, I know that these optimizing compilers are doing a lot of work. They're taking up all your RAM in case of Chrome. And they're doing all of this to guess what the type of an object is. And they're doing all these sort of speculative optimization to figure out what these types are. And I think when you're writing TypeScript, you already have this information. And you just decide to throw it away. And that's what TypeScript does, right? It takes all the type information, it just puts in their trash bin. And I think that's a lot of lost potential. I understand that it's supposed to be a type checker, and there's a lot of utility to that, but I think it could do so much more. And I think types as comments might be our way of unlocking that future where we can just encode the type information, all the metadata, within the code, within comments, and it could just be run, it could just be consumed by an optimizing compiler like Turbofan, and it could run JavaScript code natively as fast as C++.
Thank you. And can TS become part of JS in the future as it did with CoffeeScript?
What, sorry?
Can TS become a part
TS?
of TypeScript, the same?
Yeah. I think not. I think what will likely happen, and I mean that's what happened with CoffeeScript, is that there were a lot of cool things about CoffeeScript that we just picked up, and then CoffeeScript just became less and less useful. And I think that's possibly what's in the future for TypeScript. I think as we pick up more and more tools, more and more techniques from TypeScript, it might decrease in relevance for a lot of people. It might not, and that's perfectly fine. It's a great project with a lot of cool people working on it. I think this goal of just making TypeScript the JavaScript and running TypeScript in a browser, this is not shared by the TypeScript team. They are perfectly happy with what they do and where they are. And I think they believe that it's best for everybody to let JavaScript be JavaScript and TypeScript be TypeScript.
Thank you so much. Another question. Do you believe that the large and open JavaScript community is a good example for other technological communities and maybe other groups of people like political parties or social movements?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I am personally a big example of the sense that I found home in the JavaScript community. The JavaScript community has not only enabled me to get a job, I mean, that's a bit obvious, but also work on cool things and meet some of the best people I know in my life. Some of my best friends I met at conferences through JavaScript and all this beautiful ecosystem of people. And I think it's quite wonderful. I think not every community has that. Not every programming language has this sort of open, welcoming community. And yeah, it has already been a inspiration for many communities. For example, people really like the Rust community, and it's shaping up these days. But I think there's a lot of very heavy influence from the JavaScript community to that community. And yeah, I hope for the day when political parties and so on can work like that, but I'm not sure if they would prefer it.
Thank you. And what is the worst insult for a Java developer you have ever heard?
For a Java developer? Okay. We, in JavaScript, as I was just telling, we are a very open, very loving, very chill community. We, if you've been to this recently, there was a conference, R&D.js, there was a pool at the conference, and people were just hanging out at the pool. And I think that's very typical of the JavaScript community. People are just looking forward to meet each other, to have fun. And sometimes, because of this, we joke about Java is that because it's so corporate and it's so formal, that for example, we were mentioning how there's a dress code in Java conferences. You have to wear a blue tie in order to get in. And there's this stereotype that, oh, Java developers always wear a suit. So I think that's maybe the funniest thing I've heard.
Thank you very much. And another question. Should I learn JavaScript now, or should I wait and see how it works in the near future?
Well, thankfully, if I continue to have my job and TC39 continues to operate, then you'll never hit that point. You will keep thinking that it's changing, but it will keep changing. So I think the best time to learn JavaScript was, I don't know, a couple of years ago. The second best is tomorrow. So I think as soon as possible, people should learn JavaScript, and I heavily recommend it.
Thank you very much.
So maybe we can talk about some of the proposals that people like. Do any of you have a favorite proposal? If not, then I'll talk about my favorite proposal. Well, have you heard about this one? So there's a proposal called records and tuples. And do you know about this? So JavaScript has compound data types, right? Data types that are more complicated than just scalars, like strings or numbers. We have collection data types. So we have a list kind of data type, it's an array, and we have a dictionary kind of data type, and that's a plain object. And these are all mutable, and because they are compound types, they have this thing which we call compare by reference semantics, right? So you can have two arrays which are completely the same, and then they would still not be equal if you try to compare them, because they're being compared by reference. And so we're adding two data types, records and tuples, which, corresponding to objects and lists. So, and they're immutable. And because of this, they can have compare by value semantics. They can be compared with each other like strings or numbers. And that's great because now you can use these compound data types inside sets, inside maps, and you can compare them between each other. You can have so let's say you have an object that you get from the user, and you have to check that against an object that you have in your code. You'll have to do a lot of work in order to actually compare these, because if you compare them directly, it would not work. But with records and tuples, it does work. And so I'm really excited about this proposal, and I think it would add a lot of interesting functionality to JavaScript.
And sorry, saying about that records and tuples, maybe if we can, then what if we combine a record or tuple with something like inherited system? So if a record is inside of prototype as is an object.
Well, that's quite interesting. That's not something that we've explored yet. So right now, records work like plain objects, like ordinary objects, you could say, and not like typed objects. They don't have prototypes and so on. But maybe they could, and this is maybe an idea for another proposal. So we could work on this sort of interesting intersection between objects
This
and records.
again moves us to more strict type.
Yeah, and it's more strict also in the sense that the produced objects are literally immutable. And I think this is probably why some people disagree that it would be useful, because objects are mutable, they are flexible, they can have prototypes, and these prototypes can change behind the scenes. And that wouldn't be the case with a record. If you create a record with a certain prototype, that is going to be like that forever.
Oh, thank you. And about the integration with other engines, maybe you can say something about how security engines for JavaScript work and all that tooling.
Yes. So there is this thing called SES, if you know about it. SES stands for Secure ECMAScript. So Secure ECMAScript is a subset of JavaScript that only has access to certain APIs that can be used safely. So there's many APIs in JavaScript. Some of them reveal personal information about a user, and some of them are just simple. They're math or math mostly, and atomics and so on. And Secure ECMAScript only allows these APIs that do not give access to any user information. They're actually really useful for special environments where you don't want to lose this information. For example, we have a group of people who are working on blockchains and are running JavaScript on the blockchain. And you can't have access to this information because you just don't know whose device the code is actually running on. Maybe it's running on somebody's phone. Maybe it's inside a server farm. And so this is a subset of JavaScript that allows you to have this sort of constraints.
Thank you. And if we, for example, will tell something about in-between work with other frameworks, for example, Node.js, maybe Electron, can you share some more specific in detail how they are connected with TC39 and other communities?
Yes, I would really like to. Thank you. So as I was saying, TC39 is a body of really individuals and companies that come together to build the future of this language that we hopefully all love. The thing is that I sometimes feel that there is a perception in the greater community, in the people who write JavaScript, that this is a special group, that they have something special, or they're not the same, and they shouldn't sort of interact with the community. And I think that's very unfortunate. I think without the community, TC39 has really no job to do. And if TC39 is completely detached from the people who actually write JavaScript, then it's actually horrible for TC39 itself. We would create a language that nobody likes. And because of this, and this is why I'm here, is because of this, I think TC39 should meet developers and should talk to them about their problems. And vice versa. I think that developers should also get more and more involved in this organization and its processes. As I was telling you, Sergey is the only person in Russia who is in any way involved in any of this. And that's so unfortunate. That's unfortunate because I've been here, to JavaScript conferences and so on so much. And I know there's a lot of people building a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, DataArt is building amazing stuff with JavaScript and really complicated stuff. And you, sorry, you have to write some really, really tricky code in order to do this. And I think that's very unfortunate that in order to do your job, you have to write such tricky code that then makes it very hard to onboard new people, to sort of carry this information and to convey this. And I think it could be better. I think you could be involved in TC39 and shape the language in a way that works for you. And that's why I wanted to interact, is that I think it is very beneficial for anybody who's heavily involved in this ecosystem, who's writing a lot of JavaScript code. I mean, we were talking that DataArt has at least 700 active JavaScript engineers who are writing JavaScript every day. That's a lot of JavaScript code. That's like 5 times as big as my company. So I think it's very unstrategic for DataArt to not have control and not have any say in this language, for example. And the same applies for basically everyone. If you're a developer who's writing JavaScript every day and you're just completely uninvolved in the process, then it's not a great thing for you. So yeah, you can get involved as an individual. You can look out for proposals that you like, and you can just talk to people. And I think not only would it be good for you, I mean, of course, you'd be more involved in the language, but I think it would be immensely great for the language and for the people writing. Just to give an example, while building Temporal, we were running into all these issues and we were solving these problems and building an API. And a person comes along and he tells us, he makes a bunch of issues on the repository and he tells us, okay, you're doing this wrong. And we realize, okay, this person clearly knows what they're talking about. It turned out that this person had no experience actually building a programming language. They were just writing a lot of JavaScript. And we realized that it's great for us to have this fresh perspective, to have this experience of writing, on being on the other side. And we actually invited this person as an invited expert. So I think it's really useful for all of us if more people get involved and if we get more ideas, more perspectives, and just more work being done in the language. So as I was saying, in TC39, it's quite simple to get involved. I hope people do. You can see the contributor guide. You can create your own proposals. You can talk to me, and I'll champion your proposals if you want. In Node.js, in Electron, it's quite similar. They're open source projects with very open governance. You can just start making issues, start writing tests, start talking with people, most importantly. And I think you can easily get involved in any of these projects. And it's just, it takes a first step in order to do that, and then it's very smoothly said.
Sorry, thank you. How smooth is the process of entering to contribution? Because as far as I can understand, just people are afraid of that contribution movement. That initial step is very hard.
Yes,
for most
and that's exactly what I want to explain. Is that it's not so hard, and you just need to take the first step. So just for example, we have so many. If you open the third tab, there is a number of TC39 proposals. Just down below, there is a lot of TC39 proposals. Let's open Temporal, for example. And if you see in Temporal, there is a number of issues. If you check the issues, just people can make their own issues. So there's Constellation making a bunch of issues. That's people from the Apple team implementing this. There's people from Google who are also implementing this. And so if you scroll down, you'll keep finding all these issues that people have made, talking to us about different things. Different people, people who are just interested in this proposal. So that's my point, is that if you find a proposal that makes you feel good or makes you feel horrible, either way, you should talk about it. You should go to the issues and discuss it. And I think that's where it starts. That's where you start getting involved, and you can make a difference and tell people how you think it should be done. And that's really useful information. We love to get feedback. It's just that we don't get enough sometimes because people think that it's something that's not their job. But I think it is everybody's job. It's if you write JavaScript, it's your job to think about how the language is shaping up, because otherwise you're just using a tool that is completely outside of your control, and it's being created by people who might be completely detached from you.
Thank you. And that about detachment and about detaching you from all that things. If you think that the more involved we are into the development of JavaScript, then what about like big companies? You'd say that Microsoft, Google, how much they are into?
Yeah. So a great case study that I can give, and I think would be really relevant for DataArt, would be Bloomberg, right? Because Bloomberg doesn't build a browser. They just build websites, and they write a lot of JavaScript code also. And at some point they realized, okay, we're writing all this code. There is an actual cost of maintaining all these lines, and hiring managers and developers to maintain everything. What if we could just reduce our code? What if we could make our code faster, more efficient, and just smaller, easier to read, easier to understand? And we, my company, working with Bloomberg, we have pushed so many amazing features that benefit everyone, including static fields in classes, private fields, and just all these different features that have landed in JavaScript that has created a lot of difference for them. It has reduced the amount of code that they write. Their developers are happier because they're not writing something that is very scary and very chaotic. And I think it creates a lot of business value for them as well. And it also creates a lot of positive developer relation karma for them. So people who work in developer relations are really into the idea, because developers love JavaScript, hopefully, and if you're involved in this language and you're building some really interesting features, I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, and it really draws developers to you and clients to you. Actually, some clients are possibly really excited about the prospect of working with somebody who has such an influence in this area.
Thank you. And about that, there is written that academics specific is inside of the language. Can you say something about this also?
Yes, so there is a lot of academics and academic institutions that are working with TC39. We have a lot of universities from Europe and from the US, for example, who are very deeply involved. One of the best examples, because it's the one that I remember, is Jason Choi. So Jason Choi is from the University of Michigan, if I am not incorrect. And he's been doing some amazing work in JavaScript, adding things like pipelines. Pipeline operator is a well-requested feature, and he's working on that, and a bunch of other things like bigint math. So we have math, but it's for numbers. And we have bigint, but it doesn't have a math library. So we can have bigint.square root and so on. And yeah, if you're an academic, if you're a student, there's a lot of things to get involved in. And students have a lot of free time, so they could possibly make a big change in this language, and hopefully it would help them in their career, hopefully, whenever they look for a job.
Yes, and about that, then about sharing the ideas of what was deployed into the JavaScript overall community. How contribution matters. So if we say about academia, can we just navigate of how they can learn easily, or maybe just a question of the more broad experience in
Yes. So I think contributing is a great thing that matters, especially in a lot of contexts. So for example, for conferences and so on, it makes a big difference if you are into these things, because it's literally shaping up the future of the language. And I think it gives you a very fresh perspective. It gives you vision, because a lot of people have a very different mindset when they're writing a programming language, right? They think that this is a tool that they have, and they're stuck with it, that they have to work with its imperfections, with its constraints. And I think this is why it's very interesting, and it's a very fresh idea when you work on TC39, when you work on Node. So you understand that, okay, these tools also change, and these languages also evolve. And I could actually spearhead such a change, or at the very least, I could evolve with it. And I think that's a very good mindset to have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ujjwal, thank you so much. I guess if we don't have any questions, and it seems that we don't, it was amazing. Thank you once again. Colleagues, the record of this video will be available very soon, and it was great. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for having me here. It was really nice talking to you all through the camera. And yeah, hopefully you know how to reach me. My details are on the screen. But yeah, let's talk about this, and I hope that you all get more involved in this space in the future. I look forward to seeing you.